In the last two lectures, I dealt with God's will for wives. In this and the next lecture, I want to deal with God's will for husbands. And as was true for wives, most men get their idea of what husbands should be like from their own family, their own mom and dad, from their culture, and other things like that. But again, as Christians, we need to see what God's Word has to say, because in many ways, God's Word challenges our prevailing culture and the way the culture views the relationship between husbands and wives. So I want to look at a couple of important texts in this lecture, and we'll begin again, as we've talked a number of times in these lectures, with Genesis chapter 2. In verses 24 and 25, it says, "For this cause a man shall leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked, and were not ashamed." Now, it begins by saying, "For this cause," or "therefore, a man shall leave." That relates back to the account of the creation of the woman. And it indicates the reason, the importance, and the significance of the woman to the man according to God's created order. In other words, the man must change his closest human relationship, his most intimate, most personal, most revealing, most caring, most connected, and vulnerable relationship, from his parents to his wife. And we'll be talking more about this, but the fact that we become one flesh with our wife is something tremendous, because we're never said to be one flesh with our parents or with our children or with our close friends. Instead, this new relationship with your wife is the most intimate relationship that we can ever have, and God has designed it that way. Marriage is to be permanent, and remember, as I said, marriage is the primary social relationship. Once we get married, our relationship with our parents, and once we have children, our relationship with our children, are both secondary. That doesn't mean that we don't love them. We love them tremendously, but the marriage is the primary relationship. Now, to leave his father and mother implies that the husband and wife establish their own separate household. And this means that the oneness should be physical, but emotional, intellectual, decisional, and financial, as well as spiritual. All of these things are part of what it means to be one flesh. And by the way, the term flesh in some contexts is simply a physical reference, but that is not true here in Genesis. It is not primarily referring to the sexual act. Flesh is equivalent to the person. That's indicated in Genesis 6:17 and Joel 2:28. In Matthew 19, Jesus quoted this verse in the context of divorce, not sex. And in Ephesians 5, verses 28 through 32, the verse is quoted to indicate the spiritual union between Christ and the church. And therefore, when it says, "the two shall be one flesh," that is why I say that being one, it includes the whole person. So we are to be as close as possible with our wife, not only physically, but emotionally, intellectually, decisionally, financially, and spiritually. And I know, having been in East Africa many, many times, that many husbands, including pastors of churches, they keep their finances secret. And if the wife needs money for something, the husband will turn away like this, reach into his pocket, get some francs or shillings, and then give it back. That is unbiblical. There should not be secrets between husband and wife concerning the finances. This is where when we think about what these words in Genesis mean and imply for our lives, that is challenging the prevailing culture. So the question we have to ask as husbands is, am I going to run my life and my marriage according to what the culture says or what God says in his word? I mean, that's, as we say here in the U.S., that's a no-brainer. We need to obey God. Now, to cleave to his wife basically means we have a new identity, which, is after our relationship with Christ, is found, our new identity is found in our oneness with our wife. And so it says that in Genesis 2, verse 24, for this cause a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. Wife is in the singular, not the plural. God created a woman for the man, not multiple women. The Bible calls for monogamy, not polygamy. And when Jesus quoted this verse in Matthew 19, he said, the two shall become one flesh, not the three or the four. And so think about it. The ideal of monogamy is based upon, ultimately, the relationship between Christ and the church. Because just as Christ has only one bride, only one wife, the church, so a man is to have only one wife. And if you think about it, in the Bible, it is true that many of the Old Testament leaders of Israel were polygamists. But polygamy always caused problems, from the very first polygamist, who was Lamech, a man of violent and disreputable character. It caused problems in David's family. It caused problems. It turned Solomon's head to worship other gods. You see, the Bible was saying, using these examples, showing that polygamy ultimately causes problems. But the oneness, when it says, well, I've talked about the oneness, but I want to add one more thing about the two shall be one flesh. When it says that, and I've mentioned that we should be united spiritually, mentally, emotionally, financially, and in other ways, as well as physically, with our wife, remember that the wife fills that which is lacking in the husband, and just as the female's attributes complement those of the male. It's as if in marriage a new whole person has been formed, with the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. That's the ideal we should be striving for. And we can never realize this perfectly in this life. But as I mentioned in my own life, my wife and I have always had, I think, a good marriage. But I practiced law for 28 years, and when I was in law school, they told us that the law is a jealous mistress. You have to put in the time. And I did. So I worked most Saturdays, often went into the office on Sundays, was gone a lot, and I was successful. But it paid a price. I think I was a good father and a good husband, but, it's like, who was I really married to? My office and the law, or my wife? And I think it affected the relationship primarily with my children, but that's a choice I made. Now, in these last many years, I think things are different. Even though I'm gone a lot in East Africa, by putting Jesus Christ first and by getting much more serious about my marriage, I think our marriage is better in every single way than it was earlier on. And I think we've developed that oneness that is the ideal that the Bible is striving for. It takes work, but believe me, it is worth it. And when it says that the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed, of course, that is describing the situation before the fall into sin. But now, in Christ, in our regenerate, redeemed selves, we can approach that. When it says that they were naked, yes, it was a physical description, but it is broader than that. In other words, it's signifying nothing comes between the husband and wife to separate them in their relationship. It means that the husband and wife are fully exposed with no pretenses. It indicates that the husband and wife have nothing to hide, and they have no need for any cover-up. And it implies that the husband and wife are able to perfectly be open, honest, and transparent and vulnerable with each other. That's what being naked and not ashamed implies. And that is the ideal to which our marriages should strive. And I think, given the different natures, overlapping bell curves between men and women, women are more apt to be that way if their husbands would. So I think it creates kind of a greater responsibility on the part of husbands to start being like that, to open up, to be vulnerable, to be exposed, to not hide things, to be open and honest with the wife, to speak the truth in love, because if we do that, the wife certainly will do that also. Now, the next passage I want to look at is Ephesians 5. And we've talked about this again in earlier lectures, how Ephesians 5 is Paul's longest discussion of husbands and wives, but it grows from the role of husbands and wives in Ephesians 5 is simply an example of Christian living, which began in Ephesians 4, and specifically is an example of what it means to be filled with the Spirit, particularly, which began in Ephesians 5, verse 18, and it talked about speaking to one another in psalms, hymns, spiritual songs. It's how we speak. Singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord, giving thanks in all things to the Lord, and submitting yourselves one to another. And then he's taking those things and saying, now, how does this look in terms of marriage? Well, in terms of husbands, he begins in verse 25, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church, gave himself up for her, so that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless. So husbands ought also to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ also does the church, because we are members of his body. For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is great, but I am speaking with reference to Christ and the church. Nevertheless, each individual among you also is to love his own wife even as himself, and the wife must see to it that she respects her husband. Now, we talked about the background of this passage, and remember it began in verse 22 by talking about, 21, submit yourselves one to another, verse 22, wives to your own husband, as the church to Christ. Nowhere in Ephesians 5, now when talking about the role of the husband, does it say that husbands are to make or force their wives to submit or be subject to them, or even to make sure that they submit. A wife's submission is a choice that she makes, and ultimately is an issue between her and God. And therefore, that statement of Paul's, of wives to submit, are instructions to the wife, not to the husband. The emphasis on the passage I just read, beginning in verse 25, is on the husband's responsibility, not on his position as head. We are accountable to Christ for what we do or fail to do in meeting our responsibilities as husbands, not for what our wives does or fails to do in meeting her responsibility as wife. Indeed, our responsibility as a husband is probably greater than the wife's responsibility, because we are called the head. And as it says in Luke 12, verse 48b, from everyone who has been given much, much shall be required. And to whom they entrusted much, of him they will ask all the more. Now, loving our wife, we're to love our wife as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. That is a command, not an option. We are to love our wife despite the pressures of the culture and the problems in our relationship. And the importance of this is that it is mentioned 3 times in verses 25, 28, and 33. And we are to love your own wife, not someone else's wife. Now, the word for love, Greek had a number of different words for love, but the word that Paul uses in Ephesians 5 is agapao. It is a very rich term, and it implies putting someone or something first in your life, working for her, serving her, making time for the object of your love. It implies an act of the will as proving and demonstrating that love, as well as having feelings of love, affection, and esteem. So it is a very rich term. It involves all of us. And we know that because the same verb is used in John 3:16. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And Christ's command to his disciples, a new commandment I give you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. And so that is why he uses this very rich term. That is how we are to act and feel toward our wife. Now, notice that it says in Ephesians 5, we're to love our wife just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her. So we need to ask, how did Christ love the church? Well, he loved the church uniquely. Christ is the good shepherd for the particular sheep that the Father gave him. They have been chosen from before the foundation of the world. Now, we said earlier, Christ has only one bride, one wife. That is the church. He is not the bride and wife of the church and the world. He is not the husband of, or he's not the husband of the church and the world. He's not the husband of the church and the mosque. No, he is the husband of the church, his one bride, and he is faithful to her. Notice in the passage, it talks about how he loves her, having cleansed her by the washing of the water of word, that he might present to himself the church in all her glory. All he's doing is for the sake of his wife, his bride. But how else did Christ love the church? He loved the church and he loves his bride uniquely, as we are to love our wife. But he also loves his bride sacrificially. And this is the heart of what Paul is talking about here in Ephesians 5. Consider the different ways that Christ loved his bride, the church, sacrificially. He humbled himself and set aside his own glory in heaven and equality with the Father in order to take on the form of a bondservant for the sake of his bride. He gave his time, possessions, thoughts, and emotions, everything he had, to disciple his bride. He suffered physically, emotionally, and spiritually for the sake of his bride. He resisted temptation for the sake of his bride. I mean, Satan came and said, if you're the Lord, turn these stones into bread, jump off the pinnacle of the temple, bow down and worship me. Jesus did not do that, and he didn't do it for the sake of his bride. He bore his bride's grief, pain, and ultimately her sin, and he laid down his life for his bride. That is our model. Husbands, our responsibility is so great. We are to model Jesus Christ because, you see, that's the thing. Many men, and I've heard this preached, they look at what Paul says to the wife and say the wife is to submit to the husband as to the Lord, just as Christ is the head of the church. And many men That's not directed to us men. That's directed to the wife. But many men take that. You see, I am like the Lord to you. No, 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 no. We should be thinking, okay, we're to love our wife as Christ loved the church. And therefore, yes, we are to be like Christ. But are we setting aside our position for her? Are we giving her our time, possessions, thoughts, and emotions? Are we suffering physically, emotionally, and spiritually for her? Are we resisting temptation for her? Are we laying down our very life for her? And are we bearing her grief, pain, and ultimately her sin onto ourselves? That's how we are to be like Christ. And think of the manner in which Christ loved us sacrificially. He took the initiative. He took the first step, coming down from heaven. He took the initiative to love us sacrificially when we were unlovable. The Bible says, when we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. This means that we should love our wives in spite of her faults and failures and sins. And we can do this by overlooking her sins and bad habits most of the time, by seeking her happiness, seeking her welfare and her best interests, not pointing out to her her faults in front of the children or in public, but when necessary, offering constructive criticism privately with respect and humility and with pure motives of desiring to help her, not using her as an example in sermons without her express permission, and not leaving her or forsaking her, because Christ never leaves or forsakes us, and not threatening to do so. One thing my wife and I said at the beginning of our marriage, the word divorce will never cross our lips. We have never threatened to divorce each other, even if we've had an argument, or are angry, or are upset, or are hurt. You gotta make that a rule, because I will never leave or forsake her, just as Christ never leaves or forsakes us. You see, there's tremendous implications for these words. Now, again, many men take their position as head and say, they kind of lord it over their wives. But Jesus said no. He said, it's the Gentiles lord it over others, but I have not come to be served, but to serve. And so again, take this position. If we are like Christ and the wife is like the church, think on these things, because this is what this is saying here. Don't lord it over. And he gave us an example the night before he died of washing his disciples' feet. And he said, this is an example for you. You are to do this. And if the disciples were to do this for others, all the more we should be doing this for the person who is to be closest to us. Now, when Christ did that, washed his disciples' feet, did he somehow lose power, position, or authority? Did he lose his manhood? Not at all. It takes a strong person with inner strength to be able to do that. He actually grew in power, authority, and position because it takes a real man to be able to do that. Many men, maybe most men, don't do that. But, you got to humble yourself. I mean, when I was growing up, I did not have any sister in the home, but I have 3 daughters as well as 3 sons. I had to say many times, to my children, particularly my daughters, I'm sorry, and say that to my wife. Now, many men say, I am the head, I never apologize. I don't recall my own dad ever apologizing. I had to do that. You can do it. It doesn't kill you, and it actually clears the air. It actually increases, I think, your credibility and your authority when you do that. And so, now, he says that, Paul says, that we're to love her as we love our own body. No one's ever hated his body, and no one beats himself. Therefore, husbands, you are not permitted to beat your wives. The Bible is not like the Quran. The Quran says a husband can beat his wives. But no, Christ did not beat his disciples. He does not beat his sheep. And in fact, that if a man is a wife beater, that means he is disqualified from being a leader in the church, because in 1 Timothy chapter 3 it gives the qualifications to be a leader in the church, and among them are that you are to be a one-woman man, have a good relationship with your wife, and are to be worthy of respect. Now, it says in Ephesians 5 that we're to love her and sacrifice for her in order to sanctify her, cleanse her, so having no spot or wrinkle. In other words, Christ had a purpose in sacrificially loving his bride. And so for us, that means that the husband is to set the spiritual tone in the family. He is to model Christ and thereby help his wife and his children, if you have children, become more like Christ herself. In many homes, it is the wife who sets the spiritual tone of the family. Many husbands shirk their responsibility, but again, look at what Paul says in Ephesians 5, and then apply what Christ did. Everything he did was to build his wife up spiritually and in every other way. That's why if you take Christ seriously, it will affect how we relate to our wife. Now, Paul concludes his discussion in Ephesians 5 by talking about the fact that we are members of his body. He says that the mystery is great. In verse 30, we're to do this, nourish and cherish our wife, just as Christ also does the church, because we are members of his body. Now, by referring to his body, he is going back to the body metaphor or image. And so that is highlighting the oneness that we are to have with our wife. That oneness is to characterize the relationship between the husband and wife, just as Christ's body is one. And so in 1 Corinthians 1, Paul asked, has Christ been divided? The answer, of course, is no. Well, therefore, Christians, and particularly Christian husbands and wives, are not to be divided among themselves, because the two shall be one. Because when Christian husbands and wives are divided, think about this. We are misrepresenting Christ to the world. Marital discord and division is a form of separating what God has joined together. It's a form of dividing the body of Christ. And therefore, marital disunity among Christians has serious spiritual implications. This again is telling us, at root, marriage is spiritual. It reflects Christ and the church. And it is the most intimate relationship we will ever have. It is far more important than most husbands think about. So let me conclude this lecture by saying this. These passages in Genesis 2 and Ephesians 5 are the heart and core of our responsibility as husbands. They are far deeper than most of us think. Most of what Paul says in Ephesians 5 is directed to the husband, not to the wife. Our responsibility is great, so take this seriously and see what needs to change in your relationship. I guarantee you it will be worth it, because marriage should be the most wonderful relationship. You should not only love your wife, but like her, love to spend time with her. It should be fun. And when you do it right, I guarantee you it is. In the next lecture, I'll look at some other important passages that talk about God's will for husbands.